Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Have you ever stopped to think about just how amazing our sight is?
You're right. It's something we often take for granted.
Well, for this deep dive, we're going to try to understand a little bit more about how amazing our vision is. We're taking a deep dive into light and how we see, and we're going to be using the science textbook chapter as our guide.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so let's just jump right in. The chapter starts off by saying that sight is really important for us to be able to interact with and understand the world.
Yeah, think about it. So much of our daily life relies on us being able to see.
Totally. So how does it actually work? Like, how do our eyes actually allow us to see things?
Well, it all boils down to light. We see objects because they either give off their own light or they reflect light, and that light enters our eyes.
Okay, so light is reflecting. That makes me think of mirrors, which the textbook mentions too, like how a mirror can reflect light so clearly.
Exactly. And mirrors are a great way to actually visualize how light behaves. To make it easier to understand, we often talk about light traveling in straight lines, what we call rays.
Oh, okay, so when we talk about rays of light, we're basically just simplifying things to make it easier to understand how light travels and reflects and all that.
Exactly. It's a useful model.
Okay, so using this model, when one of these rays of light hits a mirror, it bounces off at a specific angle. Is that what the book is talking about when it talks about the laws of reflection?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The angle at which the light hits the mirror, we call that the angle of incidence, and it's always going to be equal to the angle at which it bounces off, which is the angle of reflection.
Okay, so it's like a perfect rebound.
Yeah, you got it. And what's even more interesting is that these laws of reflection, they don't just apply to super smooth surfaces like mirrors. They also apply to rougher surfaces too. It's just that with a rough surface, the light's reflecting off all the bumps and imperfections in different directions, so instead of getting that nice, clear reflection, we see it as more of a scattered reflection. That's called diffuse reflection.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So is that why we can still kind of see things even when they're in the shadows? Because even though there's not like direct light hitting them, there's still some light bouncing around and reflecting off of them.
You got it. It's all about those reflections. And speaking of reflections, you know how when you go to the hairdresser, sometimes they'll hold up a mirror behind your head so you can see the back of your hair?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Well, that's a great example of light being reflected twice. So the light's reflecting off the back of your head, hitting the mirror that the hairdresser is holding up, and then reflecting off that mirror and into your eyes. That's how you're able to see the back of your own head.
Whoa. Double reflection. It's like a double bounce of light. Hey, speaking of multiple reflections, have you ever used a kaleidoscope?
Oh, yeah, of course. Who hasn't? Those things are mesmerizing.
Right. It's like looking into another dimension or something. The textbook mentions them too, and I had no idea that they were all about mirrors and reflections too.
Yeah, the magic of kaleidoscopes, it all comes down to how those mirrors are positioned inside. So basically, you have these mirrors set at specific angles to each other, and they create multiple reflections of the little bits of colored glass or whatever's inside.
Oh, so that's how you get all those crazy patterns and colors, just from a few pieces of glass and some mirrors. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a great example of how a simple principle, in this case, the laws of reflection, can create something so visually complex and beautiful.
I know, right? I kind of want to go find a kaleidoscope now. But okay, so we've talked about how light travels and reflects, but how does that light actually get translated into the images that we see? Time to talk about the eye.
Let's dive into the fascinating world of the human eye.
So the textbook describes the eye as this really intricate organ with all these different parts that have to work together perfectly for us to see. Like there's the cornea, the iris, the pupil, the lens, the retina. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's a complex system for sure.
It is. And I feel like each part of that system has a really important role to play. Like the retina, for instance. The textbook says that's where the light that enters our eyes actually gets converted into electrical signals that our brain can understand as images. Is that right?
That is correct. The retina is kind of like the back wall of your eye, and it's covered in millions of these light-sensitive cells called rods and cones, which is what allows us to see.
Rods and cones. Wait, are those the things that are responsible for us being able to see in color?
You got it. The cones, they're the ones that allow us to see color. And we actually have 3 different types of cones, each one sensitive to a different range of colors. So we've got cones for red light, cones for green light, and cones for blue light. And it's the combination of signals from all these different cones that allows us to perceive the full spectrum of colors that we see.
Wow. So our ability to see color is literally all thanks to these tiny little cones in our eyes detecting different colors of light. That's incredible. What about the rods? What do they do?
The rods are amazing. They're much more sensitive to light than cones, but they can't detect color. They're what allow us to see in low light conditions.
Oh, so that's why we can't see color as well when it's dark out, because our rods are doing most of the work and our cones aren't as active.
Exactly.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
This is all so fascinating. So we've got the cornea and the pupil controlling how much light gets into our eye. Then the lens focuses that light onto the retina, and the retina converts that light into electrical signals that our brains can process.
You've got it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so the textbook also mentions something called the blind spot. What's that all about? Is that like a literal blind spot in our vision?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. It's true that we all have a blind spot in each eye, but our brains are so good at compensating for it that we don't usually even notice it.
Okay, but what actually causes the blind spot?
It has to do with the way the retina is connected to the optic nerve, which carries those electrical signals from our eyes to our brains. So there's this one spot on the retina where there aren't any rods or cones because that's where the optic nerve connects.
So any light that falls on that spot, we can't see it.
Exactly.
Wild. Our eyes have blind spots, but our brains just fill in the gaps so we don't even realize it. Our brains are amazing.
They are incredible. And speaking of our brains playing tricks on us, the textbook also touches on how our brains are able to see those flipbooks where it looks like the pictures are moving, even though it's really just a bunch of still images.
Oh, yeah, like how movies work too, right?
Yeah, exactly. It all comes down to something called persistence of vision.
Persistence of vision. What's that?
Well, basically, when we see an image, our brains actually hold on to that image for a split second after we've stopped looking at it.
Oh, really? I had no idea.
Yeah, it's true. And so when we see a series of images really quickly, like in a movie or a flip book, our brains blend those images together because of that persistence of vision, and it creates the illusion of motion.
Wow, that's incredible. Our brains are constantly filling in the blanks and making sense of the world around us. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, the textbook also mentions Braille, which is that tactile system of reading and writing for people who are blind or visually impaired. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Braille is an incredible invention. It's a system of raised dots that represent letters, numbers, and punctuation marks, and it allows people who are blind or visually impaired to read and write by feeling those dots with their fingertips.
That's so cool. So it's like a whole different way of reading and writing using touch instead of sight. And the textbook mentions that it was invented by a man named Louis Braille, who himself was blind.
That's right. And get this, he actually developed this item when he was just a teenager. Can you imagine that?
That's incredible. What a brilliant mind. And speaking of incredible, the textbook also talks about all these amazing adaptations that animals have developed when it comes to vision. Like, did you know that some animals can see colors that we can't even imagine?
It's true. Different animals have evolved to see the world in completely different ways, depending on their environment and their needs. For example, some animals that are active at night, like owls, have incredible night vision because they have way more rods in their eyes than we do.
That makes sense. And then there are some animals, like certain types of fish and reptiles, that can actually see ultraviolet light, which is invisible to us.
Exactly. And then you have insects, which have compound eyes that are made up of thousands of tiny lenses, which gives them a super wide field of view.
Wow. That's incredible. It really makes you appreciate the incredible diversity of life on Earth and all the different ways that animals have adapted to their environments.
It really does.
This is also fascinating. From the way light reflects to how our eyes work to the incredible adaptations of animals, there's so much to learn about sight and vision.
Absolutely. Welcome back to the deep dive, ready to have your minds tricked and your eyes deceived.
You know it. Optical illusions, here we come.
Okay, so remember how we were talking before about how our brains kind of fill in the gaps when it comes to our vision?
Yeah, like with the blind spot, that's crazy.
Right. Well, optical illusions really highlight that process, like how our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the visual information that our eyes are taking in, even if it means taking shortcuts or making assumptions that aren't quite right.
So it's like our brains are so used to seeing things a certain way in the real world that when we're presented with something that breaks those rules, like an optical illusion, our brains kind of freak out a little.
Kind of, yeah. It's like our brains are trying to apply the rules of the real world, like the rules of perspective and depth, to these images that are designed to mess with those rules.
That makes sense. And the textbook actually gives a really good example of this. Remember that illusion we talked about earlier with the two lines that look like they're different lengths because the arrow's at the end?
You're thinking of the Miller-Lyer illusion, a classic.
Yeah, that one. It's so weird because logically, you know that the lines are the same length, but they just don't look like it because of those arrows.
It's trippy, right? But it just shows you how powerful our brains are when it comes to interpreting visual information.
So with that illusion, are brains just like assuming that the line with the outward pointing arrows is farther away or something? Is that why it looks longer?
Exactly. Our brains have learned that when we see lines like that, with the outward pointing arrows, it often means that those lines represent something that's farther away from us, like the corner of a building or something. And because of that learned association, our brains kind of automatically adjust our perception of the line's length, even though the lines are actually identical.
Wow, that is so cool. It's like our brains are so good at their job that they sometimes overcompensate.
Pretty much. And these illusions, they're not just fun little tricks, they actually help scientists understand how our brains process visual information and how our perception works.
That's awesome. It's like
Yeah.
proof that our brains are constantly working behind the scenes to make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. And it's not just size and distance that our brains can be tricked with, it's also color. Remember those things where you stare at an image for a while and then look away and see a weird after image in a different color?
Oh, yeah. Like the one where you stare at a red image and then look at a white wall and see a green after image. That one always blew my mind.
That's a great example of how our perception of color can be influenced by what we've been looking at before. It's like our eyes kind of get used to seeing a certain color, and then when we look away, our eyes kind of overcompensate by showing us the opposite color.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, optical illusions are basically just examples of how our brains sometimes take shortcuts or make assumptions that aren't quite accurate, all in an effort to make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly trying to find patterns and make connections, and sometimes those patterns and connections aren't really there. But it's that same drive to find meaning and order in the world that allows us to be creative and solve problems.
That's a really cool way to think about it. So, even though these illusions might make us feel like our brains are playing tricks on us, it's actually a sign that our brains are working exactly as they should.
Precisely. And it just goes to show how complex and adaptable our brains really are.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much our brains do that we're not even aware of.
I know, right? It's like they're working overtime to make sense of the world.
Definitely. So we've talked about how we see the tricks our brains can play on us and even how other animals see.
And we've barely even scratched the surface.
That's true. There's still so much more to learn about sight and vision.
Oh, absolutely. But I think we've covered some really cool stuff today.
For sure. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
I agree.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into the science of sight.
It's been a pleasure exploring with you.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of light and vision.
Until next time.
Keep those minds curious.